Welcome to the Deepfake Dialogues, where we explore the impact of deepfake technology as it blurs the lines between what is real and what is fabricated. Today, I'm joined by Professor Yvonne McDermott-Rees, a professor in law at Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law at Swansea University, and a leading scholar of evidence and human rights. She is the principal investigator of the TRUE project, TRUE standing for Trust in User-Generated Evidence. Let's dive right in. The TRUE project commenced in 2022 to explore the impact that deepfakes have on trust in user-generated evidence of human rights violations. So I just wanted to begin by providing some context for our listeners. What is user-generated evidence, and what's the role that user-generated evidence plays in the documentation of human rights violations?
Thanks so much, Ashmita. So user-generated evidence, simply put, is information captured on a personal digital device. And the evidence, that's the user-generated part. The evidence part is that it's then used in legal or accountability processes. And we've seen it come up quite a lot, actually, in the context of mass human rights violations, perhaps for the obvious reason that it's often very difficult for investigators to get access to the sites of atrocities. And just the volume of content that is generated in this context means that it's often shared online as open source evidence and can be really useful in mapping out what has happened in the context of, crimes against humanity or war crimes or even genocide. So we've seen the International Criminal Court in The Hague has started to use user-generated evidence in a number of cases. Often, there are a few kind of intersecting categories of evidence. Sometimes people talk about open source evidence, sometimes digital evidence, sometimes social media evidence. But the reason we prefer the term user-generated evidence in this project is we're also really interested in looking at not just the information that's posted online and made freely available as open source information, but also sometimes information can be captured by people and shared with investigators, or can be stored on personal digital devices and obtained by investigators. And actually, in the context of domestic prosecutions of international crimes, we're definitely seeing a lot more of that sort of closed source user-generated evidence come up. So these would be, films of atrocities, images, this audio sometimes. So, yeah.
Okay. And so how do deepfakes endanger trust in user-generated evidence?
Yeah, so there's a big hypothesis, and I know you've come across it, the idea of the liar's dividend. Yeah. So that the more we're confronted with really convincing deepfake footage, the harder it comes to believe anything, including real footage. And the liar's dividend is the hypothesis that those who seek to benefit from engendering mistrust in real content really benefit from this information environment where they say, well, we can't believe anything we see anymore, and so that's not, or they can just blindly say, well, it could be fake, and then it almost shifts the burden as well on activists or people who are gathering this evidence, who are already in a disadvantaged position, to then have to not only gather that evidence, save it, transfer it to investigators or to people who are documenting atrocities. They also then have to show that it's true. So it places a higher sort of burden of proof. And I think that's possibly a bigger, we in the TRUE project, we've done a lot of interviews with judges and legal professionals. And of course, they're all very worried about deepfakes appearing in the courtroom. But probably a bigger risk with the advent of deepfakes is not that deepfake footage will come to be introduced in court, but rather that real footage might come to be reflexively dismissed as possibly fake. And that's really what the TRUE project is seeking to establish. To what extent has the deepfakes impacted on trust in real user-generated evidence? And what does that mean for these processes that we've just mentioned? So, yeah.
And so how did you personally become interested in this topic, and what led you to start the True Project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, since about 2017, I've been working on projects to do with open source evidence. My colleagues and I had a project called OSR for Rights, which ran from 2018 until 2021. And that was examining how open source information has transformed human rights fact finding. So we looked particularly at UN commissions of inquiry, fact finding missions, and things like that, to see to what extent were they using open source information, and to what purposes. Around that time, the International Criminal Court had issued an arrest warrant against a Libyan military commander called Alwar Valley, which was based largely on these videos that had been posted online showing him essentially committing an extrajudicial killing. And so we were interested in how this might be transforming our ways of knowing, essentially, about human rights violations. How things have shifted in that period, it's less than 10 years, is really quite remarkable. So in two respects. The first is that when we started that work in 2017, often we get quite a lot of pushback. Oh, this stuff on the internet, it's useful in kind of finding out the context and doing background information, but you'll never use it in court. It'll never be, relied upon to establish any facts. And that's really changed the perceptions of the utility of this kind of evidence, because now, these kind of investigations typically have an open source investigator as part of the team. It's really embedded in practices, because we've come to realize just how much we can actually find out through open source information. But the other thing that's changed rapidly in that time, of course, has been the advent of deepfakes and AI. And it was a really interesting thing. It really, since the early days of the first project of OSR for Rights, literally any time I would present on open source evidence and human rights violations, someone in the audience will put up their hand and say, yeah, but what about deepfakes? Like, sure, we know what we can see today coming out of conflicts. We know that that's, broadly reliable, or at least it is what it purports to be. But, it's only a matter of time before we just won't be able to trust anything we see. Sometimes people had seen this BuzzFeed News deepfake of Barack Obama. That seemed to be one that, like, people would say, well, I've seen this video of Barack Obama and it really does look very convincing. What do you say to that? And my answer used to be, well, look, deepfakes, you can create them to make people change what people are saying, things like that. But in order to create a piece of content that, looks like a tank driving into a village, or looks like something from the context of an armed conflict, that would be really difficult. And the technology just isn't there yet. In the last couple of years, that's changed, of course, completely. And I used to also say things like, it's not like you can just type in, I want a video of X, and then the AI creates it. Again, by today, that's exactly what you can do. So the technology, I think, has advanced far more rapidly than anyone could have ever imagined, even in the last 3-5 years. And we are seeing examples of deepfakes being shared online from the context of ongoing armed conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza and other places around the world. But what's really interesting, what we want to empirically test, is to what extent is that leading to the liar's dividend becoming a real thing? Are defendants in court raising this defense that, well, it might be fake? And actually, is that a very successful strategy? And part of the research has discovered that actually, in cases to date, we're not seeing that sort of deepfake defense appearing. Instead, people will say things like, that's not me in the image, or yeah, that's me in the image, but an important piece of context is cut. There was a gun to my head, I was forced to act in that way. Or, the other ways of challenging evidence comes up. But the idea that one could just blindly stand up and say, well, it might be a deep fake and therefore it should be dismissed, doesn't seem to have happened in practice. There are a couple of small exceptions to that. So after the January 6th, the Capitol riots, one of the defendants in one of those cases tried to say, well, we've seen this video of Nancy Pelosi, which wasn't even a deep fake. That was just like an edited video. And so therefore this footage of me isn't that reliable. That didn't seem to be very successful. And there was also a case before the European Court of Human Rights where Russia, in the case taken against it, tried to effectively, they didn't explicitly say this was a deep fake, but they effectively implied that, this might have been created using advanced technology. And again, the court basically said, well, that falls quite significantly short of what we would need to be convinced that actually this evidence isn't reliable. We would need more information to justify that position. So, I think at least at the moment, the courts seem to be in a position where they're conscious of all sorts of manipulation. This is true for, witness testimony, for documents. There's no guarantee that anything is 100% real. And so there are processes through which, either through adversarial processes, that the parties challenge it and examine evidence, or through the rules of evidence that apply in terms of how evidence needs to be authenticated before it's introduced in court. Different legal systems deal with this differently. Whether that needs to change in the next few years with the advances of deepfakes and with the advances of technology, I think remains to be seen. And that's something we're definitely exploring in the project.
Okay. Yeah, and you just touched on some of what some of your research findings, but I wanted to dive into the True project. And as I understand it, there are 3 major components. Can you describe what these are?
Sure. So we're quite a big team. We're a multidisciplinary team. It's not just lawyers. I've got some psychologists on the team, some linguists, and the work is divided, as you say, into 3 main kind of work packages. So the first is looking at the law side. So within that, my colleague Anne Housh-Connect has created this database of cases, all the cases from universal jurisdiction prosecutions of core international crimes. Most of these are in Europe, so Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, France. And she's looked at those cases that have introduced user-generated evidence and mapped whether we're seeing this deepfake defense. And the short answer is no, we're seeing other ways that this evidence is being challenged. But the idea that, it might be a deep fake, it hasn't really come up in these cases, at least not yet. The other part of that legal stuff is we've done a lot of training with judges and lawyers, and we've done interviews with judges, particularly judges of the International Criminal Court. And we're just writing up some of those findings now. But some of the key findings are, again, that judges don't perceive that AI poses this really existential threat to evidence and to fact-finding in international criminal justice, but they are keenly aware, particularly in the very politicized context that international criminal law operates, that there is a risk of misinformation, disinformation, and some of that might be AI generated. So they didn't really see a need to change the rules of evidence. They saw the flexibility that's inherent in the rules of evidence was enough actually to protect against this. But they were keenly aware that actually judges might need more training, legal professionals might need more training. And there's a big part here, which is like ensuring sort of equality between the prosecution and the defense. This is something I'm very passionate about, that where we've got really high advanced technical tools and information available to the prosecution, that should also be available to the defence, so that both parties are able to rigorously scrutinise the evidence before it's presented in court. So that's the legal side. The second side is psychology. So we've done some like large scale online psychology experiments with lay people, members of the public, just trying to assess what the sort of baseline levels of trust in user-generated evidence are, and then in turn what the impact of things like deepfakes are on people's perceptions of this kind of information. And we've also looked at things like warnings, what's the impact of that? And in general, in some of our online studies, we've found that people are, I would say, they've got a healthy degree of skepticism. This is stuff you've probably come across too in your sort of public education work, that people are aware. Maybe they're not so much aware of deepfakes, but they're also not, blindly believing everything they see online. So people will say things like, I need to look at the source. If I don't know the source of the information, I might need to do more digging on that. I'll need to see if it's corroborated. They don't use that term. They say, I wonder if it's reported somewhere else. So yeah, we're just kind of exploring that. And then I've got a brilliant postdoc on that part of the project, Marianne, who's done some really interesting experiments, and my PhD student, Ruben, who looks specifically at deepfake detection abilities, human deepfake detection abilities, and particularly what he calls confidence calibration. So all the evidence suggests that people generally aren't that good at spotting deepfakes, at spotting whether something's AI generated or not. It's slightly better than chance. So it's like 60% detection accuracy rate. But it's the classic sort of Dunning-Kruger effect, in that the worse people are at detecting deepfakes, the better they think they are, and vice versa. So Ruben's work is really unpacking that. Are there different interventions we could do to calibrate people's confidence? So not to turn people into, thinking everything is fake, but to kind of make sure that ensure that their confidence levels match their actual detection ability. So he's done some studies with various feedback interventions. And the last part is our jury studies. So we put on a mock trial back in 2023, an entire trial with a real judge, real legal professionals, a real life expert witness, an investigator from Bellingcat. And we devised this whole fictional scenario where a piece of evidence, user-generated evidence, was really central to the prosecution's case. Our expert witness was examined and cross-examined by the prosecution defence lawyers. We wanted to see how people evaluate user-generated evidence in a realistic scenario, because we're conscious that when you ask people online, what will you do when it comes to evaluating this kind of evidence? They say they'll do really logical things, but when you put them into a real life context, sometimes what they do is quite different. So yeah, we're just kind of unpicking that. So I've got a brilliant PhD student, Becca, who has done this linguistic analysis of the mock jury simulations. And there's some really interesting findings coming out of that. One is how perceptions on the weakness of one piece of evidence can then almost infect jurors' perceptions of other evidence on the record. That's interesting, and I think significant for future cases. She's also looked at the sort of the mechanics of jury deliberations, how it works, how people interact, and that's all been really interesting. And the one thing that I find super fascinating in how our juries approached this task was how they perceive the standard of proof. So as you know, the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt, but without exception almost. In one of our we had 11 jury groups in total, so 132 people. Without exception, someone would say things like, well, are you 100% sure? Because the judge said you have to be 100%. The judge didn't say that at all, but this really quite a high perception of what the standard of proof requires. So that's something that we'll continue to unpick and examine in a bit more detail as the research progresses. So that's it.
Okay, awesome. And where do you think this is going in the future? And do you have any anything you want to say to wrap up?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So in terms of future directions, I think in general with AI, and not just deepfakes, but with things like chatbots, AI-generated chatbots and things, we're still in the place where we're trying to unpack what the harms of these technologies might be. So, of course, in the True Project, we're thinking about the sort of broader societal harms that might result in people not believing what they see anymore. So that has an impact on obviously education, and this is why the work you're doing is so important. We always say to people, don't just look at the piece of content, look at the source, look at the, is it verified, is it corroborated by other pieces of information? So don't just blindly say, well, I saw the video and therefore I believe it is. But then equally, we don't want to turn people into complete skeptics that they don't believe anything they see anymore. But in general, I think, I'm thinking a lot these days about what does it mean when we increasingly turn to ChatGPT or to other AI-generated chatbots to, conduct our work. What skills are we losing here when it comes to write? For me, as someone who writes for a living, what does it mean when those research and writing skills are lost? I think that's another big issue that we'll have to face societally in coming years. We see it a lot in law. So there have been a lot of high profile cases where people are citing hallucinated cases, basically. And so there are issues, of course, around legal ethics. But I think there's also bigger issues about, making sure that people still have those basic research skills. I worry a lot about the sort of Google Maps effect, right? That like none of us can read a map anymore. So, what does that mean if we increasingly use ChatGPT and things for our work? And then the last thing is on AI harms. I'm interested in, how things like chatbots might impact on users' health. So we've seen some examples of, mental health and chatbots encouraging people to commit suicide, for example. So yeah, those new forms of harm, some of which similar to, as I said at the start, we see how quickly technology develops. There may be new forms of harm that are just unforeseeable at the moment, or there are some probably that are very foreseeable, but people don't want to think about them or to address them before they become big harms. So yeah, those are bigger issues that I'm thinking about.
Okay, awesome. And where can people learn more about the True Project and you?
Yeah. So our website is True Project, www.trueproject.co.uk. We also have a YouTube channel where you can see the mock trial that we put on and various other pieces of content. But yeah, on our website, we tend to publish all the articles that we've been producing and pieces of research.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. This was super interesting and insightful.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deepfake Dialogues. If you found this conversation insightful, please follow and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. See you in the next episode.